This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 538 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We're only a week away from the regular season podcast schedule, which scares the living crap out of me because that means a lot of work for me. But I'm excited about it. We're going to have a great year, I can feel it. Before we get serious about the season and before I start doing 4 episodes a week starting next week, let's get a little weird. Let's talk about bold predictions for the 2021 fantasy football season. Now, I write a bold predictions piece on NumberFire.com every year. And to be honest, the hit rate on these pieces, it's sometimes better than a standard article I'll do on players to target. I try not to be bold just for the sake of being bold. I'm not throwing takes at a wall at random. I try to put serious thought into these predictions. I try to think of a player's honest range of outcomes, and if one of those outcomes on one side of the spectrum hits, it's not hard to see a bold prediction around that player come true. So today I'm going to talk through 10 of the 15 bold predictions that I wrote up in my article on NumberFire. And then I'm going to add 2 more that you can only get on this podcast, the Late Round Podcast. Now, before getting into those predictions, I want to remind you that FanDuel is offering an exclusive promotion for new sportsbook users. Join FanDuel Sportsbook today and make your first bet. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund of up to $1,000 in site credit within 72 hours. Your first bet after depositing will qualify. If you have multiple selections on one bet slip, it will be the first selection that you made. Head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook today and place your first bet. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. New users only. Max bonus $1,000 in site credit. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Virginia. Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789 or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. Trey Lance will finish top 5 in quarterback points per game. This is obviously a bold prediction because Trey Lance right now, despite getting hype, he's still usually being drafted outside the top 10 at the quarterback position, especially in your home leagues. In your home leagues, he's usually like a mid-range QB2. But here's why this can happen. It's very obvious that in today's game of fantasy football, you need that mobility at the quarterback position for a true ceiling. There's 2 ways that quarterbacks are giving you a very, very good season in fantasy football. One way is through an outlier season in touchdown rate, like we saw with Aaron Rodgers last year. The other way is through rushing, and Trey Lance definitely can bring the rushing. He rushed for 1,100 yards in his only season as starter in college. He found the end zone 14 times. He can bring that element to the NFL even if he hasn't shown that so far in the preseason. On top of that, the 49ers have the easiest schedule in football when looking at team win totals in terms of schedule strength using FanDuel Sportsbook numbers. San Francisco has a coaching staff that's ranked in the top half of the league in each of the last 4 years in yards per play, despite inconsistent quarterback availability. The 49ers also have a very, very good group of pass catchers. You have Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel at wide receiver, and you have one of the best tight ends in football in George Kittle. The circumstances around Trey Lance are great. Once he starts, and maybe that won't be week 1, but once he starts, I'm expecting big things. Tom Brady will finish outside the top 12 at the quarterback position. This one's bold because people really like Tom Brady. He's being selected as a top 10 quarterback. But here's the thing, I don't actually think this is that bold of a take. Here's why this can happen. Over the last 2 seasons, I already talked about the mobility stuff, but over the last 2 seasons, we've seen top 12 quarterbacks score 18.9% and 18.2% of their fantasy points via the ground. That's significantly higher than any 2 seasons over the last decade. And as we know, Tom Brady's a dad runner. So for him to have a difference-making season in fantasy football, he needs an outlier touchdown rate. Can that happen? Yeah, of course. Look at his wide receivers. Of course that can happen. I'm not selling it otherwise, but I'm looking at his range of outcomes here. Last season, Tom Brady threw 40 touchdowns. He had the 3rd highest touchdown rate of his career, and he still finishes the QB 11 in points per game. The QB 10 if you don't want to include Dak Prescott. So again, this one's not all that bold. If you heard this one and you thought it was bold, I would probably reevaluate the way that you're viewing Tom Brady in fantasy football. Trey Sermon will outscore both Myles Gaskin and Mike Davis. So since I wrote my bold predictions article, this one's becoming less and less bold. But it's still bold, because Myles Gaskin and Mike Davis are generally being drafted ahead of Trey Sermon. The easiest way to frame this argument, though, is to look at the downside of Gaskin and Davis. With Gaskin, he could be a committee back. Malcolm Brown is already seeing some work in the preseason, although Gaskin looks better. And we've heard the Dolphins talk about having a committee. With Mike Davis, I talked about this in the Players to Avoid podcast. He's a 28-year-old journeyman running back who's never been a true bell cow in the NFL. He's 100% being boosted in average draft position because of lack of competition in the Falcons' backfield. And that's fine. I understand that. But there's a lot of fragility to that situation. Because you're not just drafting Mike Davis, the player. You're drafting Mike Davis more so for his situation. Meanwhile, Trey Sermon fits the ambiguous RB1 theory really well. I won't get into the ambiguous RB1 theory. You guys have heard me talk about it over the last couple of months, but he fits that mold. He's a middle round running back with a teammate being drafted with him in the middle rounds, and he's the RB1 by ADP on that team. Those guys have better hit rates than the RB2s, a lot better. And as I just talked about, the 49ers have a very easy schedule this year. That means more positive game scripts, which could mean more love for Trey Sermon. The best fantasy football quarterback with the first name Justin this season will be Justin Fields. Now, this one's obviously very bold because of Justin Herbert. Justin Herbert's being drafted significantly ahead of Justin Fields. People on Twitter were not happy to hear this particular bold prediction. But hear me out here. I do have Justin Herbert ranked ahead of Justin Fields. Let me first get that out of the way. But there is some reason that on a points per game basis, Justin Fields can outscore Justin Herbert. I've been talking about the importance of rushing already throughout this podcast. And Justin Fields can bring that. We've seen that in the preseason. He ran a 4.44 40 at his pro day. We know that he can get it done on the ground. And that baseline can truly catapult him into QB1 territory. Since 2011, we've had 27 quarterbacks rush for 500 or more yards. 20 of those quarterbacks have finished as QB1s in fantasy football. And again, Justin Herbert should be ranked as a top 10 quarterback entering the year. I'm not arguing that. But keep in mind that things weren't totally perfect during his rookie season. He scored fewer than 17 fantasy points in 4 of his final 6 games. During that stretch, his touchdown rate fell by about 2.5% versus the front half of the season. I think there's a wider range of outcomes for Justin Herbert than most are expecting. Because I do think that in his arsenal is sort of a Josh Allen mobility-like season, where he might be able to find the end zone a good bit and he might be able to rush the ball more than we expect. I just don't think he's as aggressive as Josh Allen is on the ground. So we might not see that. And if we don't see that, then Justin Herbert is just a pocket passer for the most part. And again, in order for those pocket passers to be true difference makers, they need outlier seasons and touchdown rate. If Justin Herbert gets a little bit unlucky from that perspective, Justin Fields could realistically outscore him. Najee Harris will finish as a top 8 running back. This one's bold because Harris is often being drafted outside the top 12 at his position. But the name of the game is volume. Najee Harris is going to be the bell cow in the Steelers offense. He came in with a 96th percentile rating in my prospect model. He is the best grade of any running back that's come out over the last 2 years. Now, a lot of that has to do with good draft capital, but that strong draft capital can give us comfort that the Steelers are going to use him a lot. They're in win now mode with Ben Roethlisberger being 65 years old. This isn't a situation like Mike Davis where there's a chance that another running back could just take over some work in that backfield. This is Najee Harris's backfield. In 2018, James Conner in 13 games, he saw over 70% of Pittsburgh's running back rushes and a target share above 10%. Let's just assume that Najee Harris hits those marks. He would join a list of 39 running backs over the last 10 years to hit those marks. Of those backs, only 2 of them finished outside the top 10 of the position in season-long scoring. Now, obviously, a player seeing that much work, he was probably healthy. But even on a points per game basis, those running backs were still really good. 33 of the 39 scored 17 or more PPR points per game. Why is that 17 number important? Because it was the RB8 last season. That's why Najee Harris can be a top 8 running back here in 2021. Javonte Williams will be a top 10 running back during the second half of the season. This one's bold because Williams is usually drafted outside the top 24 at the running back position. But this can happen. I do think we're going to see a committee to start the year in Denver, where Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams are splitting a lot of work. But there's a chance as the season goes on that Williams' talent is just undeniable. He was a 92nd percentile prospect in my model. He was a top 6 running back across the last 2 draft classes. And Pro Football Focus's data gave him the top broken tackles per attempt rate that they had ever seen. Javonte Williams is really good. And he's a really good pass protector too, which could throw him on the field early and often. And we've seen rookie running backs just do really well during the second half of seasons in recent history. Jonathan Taylor is a very easy example of this from last year, but we also had Antonio Gibson, J.K. Dobbins, DeAndre Swift from last season, Miles Sanders from a couple of years ago. We've seen this happen plenty. So why not with Javonte Williams? Antonio Brown will outscore Brandon Ayuk. This one's bold because Ayuk is going significantly higher in drafts than Antonio Brown is. And make no mistake, Brandon Ayuk has a very real shot to have a big year. I have Ayuk ranked ahead of Antonio Brown. This is less about the ceiling for Ayuk and more about the floor. I think he's going to be productive enough that he's not going to sink your team. He's a really good wide receiver. I talked about that on last week's mailbag episode. But there are red flags surrounding his situation. Like I said, the 49ers entering the season, they have the easiest schedule in the league. That could mean more positive game scripts and less passing. Over the last 3 years, San Francisco's ranked 22nd, 29th, and 21st in neutral script pass rate. You think they're going to be a very pass-heavy team? Probably not. And as I've talked about on this show back in June, rookie quarterbacks generally aren't good for pass catchers, and neither are mobile quarterbacks. That's exactly what Trey Lance is. There might be enough volume to support Brandon Ayuk being a top 20 wide receiver. I'm not ruling that out at all. I'm just looking at his range of outcomes here, and on the lower end, it's not that great. And I'm not pretending that Antonio Brown is a lock to finish as a top 20 wide receiver either. But it's not crazy to think that he could. Without any reps with the Buccaneers last season, Brown stepped in and he averaged a 20% target share per game. If you want to remove his outlier performance in Week 17, that was still 17.6%. He was also targeted on 18.9% of his snaps played. That was the 5th highest among all offensive skill players across the NFL. When Antonio Brown was on the field, Tom Brady was throwing him the ball. That's what that says. Is it that hard to imagine that one of the best wide receivers of all time, who's now getting normal work during an offseason, that he has a strong fantasy season? The Bucs are in a pass-friendly offense. Antonio Brown could have a very good fantasy season. Devontae Smith will lead rookie wide receivers in fantasy points scored. This one's bold because Devontae Smith, despite all the stuff going on with Jamar Chase, he's still being drafted well after Jamar Chase. And look, Jamar Chase is one of the best prospects that my model has ever seen. He's a 99th percentile prospect. But Devontae Smith is a 98th percentile prospect. He's not that far behind. I think that you could say that the situation for Jamar Chase is more attractive than the one for Devontae Smith here in year one. Because the quarterback position looks more locked in Cincinnati than it does in Philadelphia, and Cincinnati is a more pass-heavy team. Despite the competition in Cincinnati, they're going to throw a lot. And the whole thing about mobile quarterbacks not being good for fantasy for their pass catchers, that's very true. And Jalen Hurts is a mobile quarterback, so that will hurt Devontae Smith. But here's the thing, Devontae Smith could capture a pretty big target share in that Philadelphia offense this year. And the fact that he's the first Philadelphia pass catcher to be selected in drafts, that matters too. Historically, middle round wide receivers who are the first wideouts drafted from their teams by average draft position, they tend to outperform expectation at a higher rate compared to the alternative. And when those receivers don't have a teammate being drafted with them in the middle rounds, that hit rate increases even more. Episode 526 of the Late Round Podcast talks about this. And that's Devontae Smith. He doesn't have teammates being drafted around him, and he's a middle round wide receiver. And like I said, he's an elite prospect. So no one should be shocked at all if Devontae Smith is the best rookie wide receiver this year in fantasy football. Tyler Higbee and Dallas Goedert will finish outside the top 12 at tight end. This one's bold because both of those tight ends are being drafted well inside the top 12. But I think this could happen. I already talked about Dallas Goedert on the Players to Avoid episode. And the reason I talked about him on that show is because the Eagles still have Zach Ertz. Goddard's splits with a healthy Zach Ertz are not very good. But then on top of all that, look at what we've seen historically from an ADP perspective from middle round tight ends. Usually the tight ends who break out in the middle rounds, they're the first pass catchers being drafted from their team, similar to the wide receiver position. Over the last 10 years, we've had 55 tight ends get selected in rounds 6 through 9 who weren't the top pass catcher from their teams by ADP. So like Dallas Goedert this year, Devontae Smith is being drafted ahead of him. Tyler Higbee this year, you have Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods being drafted ahead of him. If you look at ADP expectation and how those tight ends perform, it's not great. Only 3 of them have been true breakouts. I'm not sitting here saying that Higbee and Goddard aren't capable of scoring fantasy points. Like, they'll probably be fine enough. But we have a long history of these types of tight ends, these middle round tight ends, not doing very well in fantasy football. Michael Pittman will outscore DJ Chark. This one's bold because Pittman goes a lot later than DJ Chark in drafts. But Chark is someone that I'm not very into this year. I talked about that in the Players to Avoid episode. He's playing with a rookie quarterback. He's had overrated production throughout his NFL career. And is he even the best wide receiver on the Jags? I don't know that for sure. And Pittman has flown under the radar because of this Carson Wentz injury. But Carson Wentz looks like he's going to be healthy. And Pittman fits a lot of the criteria when looking for a breakout wide receiver. He's the first pass catcher being selected on the Colts by ADP. That's a plus. He's a second-year wide receiver. They tend to break out at a much more significant rate. He's part of an ambiguous wide receiver group, and his target share wasn't totally non-existent last year. You can listen to more about breakout wide receivers on an episode that I did last month. Pittman has a real shot to be an alpha on his team. Now, obviously, DJ Chark does too, but I'm talking bold predictions here. What if Michael Pittman is and DJ Chark isn't? It's not that hard to see that happening, which is why I think Pittman can outscore DJ Chark very easily. Now, like I said at the top, I've got 2 bold predictions that weren't in my article that I'm going to share on today's show. The first is that Jerry Jeudy will be a top 15 wide receiver this year in PPR formats. This is sort of just an extension of my Players to Target episode from a couple of weeks ago. But Jerry Jeudy really is fitting a lot of the criteria that I laid out in that July episode on spotting breakout wide receivers. I'm going to reiterate some of that I just talked about with Michael Pittman. But breakout wide receivers, they typically come from ambiguous situations. There's no clear-cut wide receiver in that Broncos offense. And on top of that, wide receivers have a higher hit rate when they're the first wideout drafted from their team. Jerry Jeudy has separated himself from Courtland Sutton. Breakout wide receivers typically don't come from nowhere. Jerry Jeudy is not coming from nowhere. He had a 21.2% target share last year. Breakout wide receivers don't need to have a stud quarterback. And Jerry Jeudy does not have that by ADP, even by not ADP. And then breakout wide receivers hit at a more substantial rate when they're second-year wide receivers. That's what Jerry Jeudy is. I love me some Jerry Jeudy this year. I've pegged him as this year's Deontay Johnson, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Now, the last bold prediction today is that Terrace Marshall will lead the Panthers in receiving touchdowns. This one's spicy. This is a spicy take. The reason it's bold is because Marshall's probably going to be, at best, the 4th option in target share in this Panthers offense. You've got Christian McCaffrey, DJ Moore, and Robbie Anderson. And you should absolutely take those players ahead of Terrace Marshall. But you guys know I love me some Terrace Marshall. He played a large percentage of his snaps from the slot during his final year at LSU. And it's natural for him to play a lot of his snaps from there this year with DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson on the perimeter. It's a way to let Marshall find the field right away. And he's a beast. Robbie Anderson struggled to score last year, and DJ Moore has struggled to score his entire career. He has 10 career touchdowns in 3 seasons, despite a lot of targets and overall production. Moore only had 8 red zone targets last year. 59 wide receivers had more. Now, I like DJ Moore a lot this year. Don't take this the wrong way. I think Moore has an incredible ceiling because imagine a world where he gets utilized more there. I'm just saying that it's possible that similar usage to 2020 could result in an opportunity for Terrace Marshall, who's got the best height-weight combo among the trio of wide receivers. He's the best red zone threat that they have. And that red zone work, if he does play the slot a good bit, it could be against more advantageous matchups. So that's the last prediction. Terrace Marshall leading the Carolina Panthers in receiving touchdowns. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.